The hearing room trembles with tension before the cameras even catch focus. Pam Bondi's voice cuts through the air like a blade, shrill, commanding, pushing each syllable as if volume alone could win the day. Every word lands with the confident tone of someone too used to getting the last word. Staffers lower their eyes. Photographers lean forward. The room has turned into a theater, and she is determined to be its star. Across the table sits Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The lights glare against polished oak, and yet she seems untouched by them, hands folded, shoulders perfectly square, eyes focused on Bondi with unflinching precision. The tempest on the other side meets a still lake, and that very calm feels more dangerous than any shout. Bondi leans in further, voice rising. You know exactly what you've done. The words echo off marble and ambition. Somewhere, a camera shutter clicks. That single sound feels like punctuation, cold, metallic, final. The audience doesn't need context to understand what's happening. They know the script, a loud personality trying to overpower quiet authority. But they also sense this one might not end the way it usually does. The air grows thick with spectacle. Aides whisper behind clipboards. Viewers online are already clipping footage, typing captions, building narratives. This isn't just politics, it's the kind of moment that spreads faster than any press release. Crockett doesn't flinch. A slow breath. A pause so small it feels seismic. Her eyes narrow slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. The rhythm of her stillness begins to own the room. Bondi's voice cracks once, a barely perceptible strain, and the silence that follows is louder than anything she said. The cameras pivot toward Crockett now. Every movement she makes, from the lift of her chin to the soft exhale, seems choreographed by serenity itself. Power has shifted, imperceptibly but undeniably. The noise dwindles. Even Bondi seems unsure for a split second, realizing that shouting into still air only amplifies your own echo. Crockett glances down, then up again, gaze unwavering. The microphones wait like the crowd before the orchestra's first note. And then, without raising her voice, without breaking her poise, she opens her mouth. But when she finally spoke, the entire room stopped breathing. The hearing had begun as a routine display of power, an inquiry meant to generate headlines rather than solutions. Yet beneath the formal language and congressional decorum, something raw was surfacing. This wasn't merely about policy, it was about permission. Who gets to question loudly? Who must prove calm at all costs? Who is praised for passion, and who is punished for the same fire? Pam Bondi, once the steely prosecutor of Florida, carried her reputation into the room like a crown. Years of camera lights and talk show roundtables had given her an aura of impenetrable confidence. To her supporters, she embodied the no-nonsense crusader, protector of an older order that prized volume disguised as conviction. But to many watching today, she represented a style of politics that thrived on dominance, not dialogue, authority that shouted others into silence. Facing her across the dais was Jasmine Crockett, whose presence alone disrupted the hierarchy. She wasn't the prototypical lawmaker groomed by insider networks. She was younger, sharper, visibly unbothered by the staged aggression that had rattled veterans before her. Where Bondi emanated legacy, Crockett radiated arrival, a signal that a new political generation was no longer asking for credibility but demanding it through precision and grace. The issue on paper concerned oversight, contracts, procedural integrity. But everybody in that room understood that what hung in the air was bigger: legitimacy. The tension wasn't merely about who was right, it was about whose existence in that seat was tolerated. Every question, every interruption was a test, a coded reminder that women of color are still expected to earn the silence men are freely given. The gallery watched this quiet tug of power unfold with uneasy fascination. The old guard sat stiff, certain they were still the arbiters of seriousness. But even they felt something shifting in the timbre of the exchange. Every time Bondi raised her tone, Crockett responded not with equal force but with clarity, turning each attempt at condescension into its own undoing. This was the arena that shaped America's future debates. Not backrooms filled with cigars and lapel pins, but public hearings broadcast like serial dramas, where rhetoric became performance and identity became proof. And here, before a live audience, the contrast looked biblical: Bondi's certainty beginning to sweat under the fluorescent lights, Crockett's calm composure beginning to gleam. Viewers at home sensed it too. Social feeds trembled with early reactions: she's still calm. Why won't Bondi stop talking over her? Hashtags weren't yet born, but they were already gestating in minds fired by indignation. Within the chamber, you could feel the generational current intensifying. Staffers young enough to call Crockett their role model pretended to type notes while secretly reveling in every poised microsecond. Older colleagues shifted in their seats, muttering about decorum, uneasy that the rules of who gets applauded were being rewritten before their eyes. For Bondi, this was supposed to be control reaffirmed, a reminder that she, the veteran, could still command attention at will. For Crockett, this was endurance in action. She wasn't performing rebellion, she was embodying evolution. Each heartbeat in that hall measured the distance between eras, the fading certainty of the loud and the quiet emergence of the unshakable. And then, as the questioning intensified, Bondi's frustration began to crack into something dangerously personal. Her jabs grew less about policy, more about presence. The line between argument and attack blurred. The crowd leaned in, the cameras refocused. The quiet chamber had transformed into a national stage. And yet, in that crowded chamber, everyone knew Pam had just lit a fuse she couldn't unlight. Before the flashbulbs and partisan panels, before her voice became shorthand for controversy, Pam Bondi had been the image of authority. In the early 2000s, she was Florida's iron prosecutor, the one who nightly news anchors described as fearless and relentless. She took on high-profile cases with camera-ready confidence, a posture as straight as her headlines. Her words carried the polish of someone accustomed to being the final voice in the room. For years, that certainty served her well. But prestige is a delicate currency, and Bondi's brand of justice was built in an era when televised toughness played better than nuance. As the decades turned and public appetite for spectacle deepened, she adapted with the precision of someone unwilling to fade quietly. When political movements began swallowing institutional careers whole, she chose the path of relevance. She became a familiar face on cable news, tanned, composed, punctuating sentences with moral clarity only the camera could manufacture. The shift felt smooth to her followers and jarring to her critics. No longer bound by courtroom protocol, Bondi discovered the thrill of the broad accusation, the comfort of an audience predisposed to clap before she even unfolded her notes. On set, she learned that outrage generated ratings faster than reason, that a well-timed scowl played better than a careful explanation. The prosecutor's instinct for absolute victory mutated into a pundit's addiction to constant attention. Her voice, once measured for judicial decorum, found a home in monologues crafted to sting rather than persuade. Still, behind those perfectly timed smiles and clipped indignations, there lingered an unease she couldn't quite name. Public life moves in cycles, and she had watched peers drift into irrelevance, their airtime reduced to nostalgic cameos. The thought terrified her. So as new voices arrived, young, diverse, fluent in moral vocabulary that didn't sound rehearsed, Bondi's veneer of command began to harden into defensiveness. By the time she walked into the committee hearing, pride was her armor and fear her fuel. She told herself that what she wanted was truth, accountability, fairness. But what she needed was affirmation, that in this changing landscape, her sharp words still mattered. The hearing offered a stage large enough to remind everyone she was still in the game. Moments before the cameras rolled, she felt that familiar rush, half adrenaline, half anxiety disguised as conviction. Her notes were neat, but beneath them lay the unwritten motive: reclaim control. The younger members unsettled her. Their ease with candor, their unapologetic empathy, it read to her as insubordination. They didn't defer as she once had to her elders. They interrupted, they corrected, they did so without guilt. She read it as disrespect. To the audience watching later, that insecurity would be invisible beneath her polished aggression. Yet those close to her caught glimpses, the quick glance at her reflection in the hallway window, the rehearsed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew charm could no longer save her from obsolescence in a world where sincerity trumped theatrics. Her adversarial instincts kicked in early during the session. Confrontation was her comfort zone, control was her native language. Every question became a sparring match designed less to clarify facts than to assert dominance. In her mind, interruption equaled victory, volume equaled command. She wielded each word like evidence before an unseen jury, convinced that the louder argument would become the truer one. But the world had changed since her heyday. The audience was more discerning now, their sympathies shifting toward authenticity. They no longer cheered intimidation, they celebrated restraint. It was a subtle evolution Bondi hadn't fully grasped. The more force she used, the more transparent her insecurity became to those watching. In the chamber, she caught glimpses of faces she didn't recognize: new members, younger staffers, citizens who had grown up listening to different voices, voices like Jasmine Crockett's. They represented what Bondi had resisted acknowledging: the conversation no longer belonged exclusively to her generation. She mistook their curiosity for challenge, their composure for complacency. That misreading would cost her. Underneath the tailored suit and manufactured poise, Bondi was searching for confirmation that she was still indispensable. This hearing offered her that illusion for one more round. So when Crockett met her questions with silence instead of panic, it ignited something primal in her: a need to reassert hierarchy in front of witnesses. The prosecutor re-emerged, and the performance began. The first outburst wasn't spontaneous, it was instinctive, a throwback to the days when interruptions silenced opposition. But here, the tactic rang hollow. Cameras no longer panned to her exclamation points, they lingered instead on the person absorbing them with measured calm. That subtle shift, the gaze moving away from the aggressor toward the poised, was the mirror she dreaded. She could feel relevance slipping not because she'd lost her edge, but because the audience had evolved. As her words climbed higher, so did the tension, pulling the air tight inside the chamber. She mistook that silence for concession, unaware it was the stillness that precedes reversal. Bondi had built her reputation on speaking over opponents, on turning noise into authority. She believed she could talk over anyone, but today, her voice would meet its match. Before she ever took a congressional oath, Jasmine Crockett was already fluent in the language of struggle. Her mornings began before dawn, the streetlights still blinking in Dallas as she packed legal pads into a worn briefcase. The courthouse at that hour smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a place where justice was supposed to arrive neatly at 9. For public defenders like her, it never did. She moved quickly through corridors lined with uncertainty. Clients waiting on cement benches, their stories tangled in paperwork, their faith in the system hanging by a thread. She learned to speak softly enough to be heard. It was a survival skill, not a choice. In rooms where the loudest person thought they were always right, Jasmine mastered control, intonation, pacing, silence used as punctuation. Her words didn't crash into people, they landed with intent. More than once, a judge looked over his glasses, perhaps expecting an outburst from this young black woman who dared to match his logic point for point. None came. She waited him out, word by measured word, until the record itself favored her calm. Outside those courtrooms, she lived close to the people often locked out of them. Her evenings were spent in church basements and community centers, spaces swollen with frustration and hope. Folding chairs squeaked under tired parents and restless kids. Someone's aunt brought homemade cornbread, someone else whispered about another missed paycheck. Jasmine listened, really listened, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a rhythm familiar to anyone who had ever had to fight for attention without raising their volume. "You're the first person who believed me," one client told her after winning a case everyone else had written off. She smiled, not out of pride but relief. Belief, she understood, was the rarest form of representation. Years of doing that work sculpted her discipline. Every condescending laugh, every eye roll from opposing counsel, every backhanded compliment about her composure, became another layer of armor. She never announced anger, she refined it. She could absorb mockery without cracking, file it under motivation, and keep speaking. That patience wasn't fragility, it was strategy. By the time she ran for office, her campaign felt less like ambition and more like necessity. The neighborhoods she served needed a voice that didn't need translation. Her slogan was simple, for the people who are always talked over. It wasn't crafted by consultants, it came from memory, the hundreds of moments she'd watched someone's truth dismissed because it wasn't delivered in the right tone. On election night, when the final precincts reported in her favor, she didn't cry or dance. She stood still, hands clasped, as if steadying herself for a larger argument yet to come. In the halls of Congress, that argument only grew louder. Some colleagues mistook her politeness for pliability, her collegial smile for consent. They didn't understand that she heard everything, the micro-interruptions, the coded compliments, the shifting expectations. Where others might react, Jasmine took notes. Her silence was diagnostic. She studied the rhythm of arrogance until she could predict its next sentence. What set her apart wasn't temperament, it was training. The streets she served, the cases she handled, the students she mentored had all conspired to teach her how to center herself in chaos. So when television analysts described her as collected after her early speeches, she knew they were missing the point entirely. Her calm wasn't the absence of fire, it was its containment. Behind that control lived 1,000 memories of people who couldn't afford to lose theirs. She carried those faces with her everywhere. The single father she defended who couldn't read his own indictment, the teenage girl accused of stealing from a store that never noticed her until then, the elderly woman who called Jasmine baby after testifying against a landlord. They weren't stories to be archived, they were reminders that dignity often walks on the quietest feet. Even her church-going grandmother had warned her long ago, "Child, the world expects you to break. Don't give them the show." That lesson became her mantra. Every time someone mistook her grace for weakness, every time a pundit dismissed her intellect as passion, she remembered the directive: no spectacle, just strength in plain view. So when Jasmine walked into that committee hearing, she wasn't untested, she was perfectly tempered. Her stillness under Bondi's glare wasn't a new discovery caught on livestream. It was the product of an entire lifetime calibrated to withstand storms louder, crueler, and far longer than one woman's tirade. She didn't see an enemy across the table, she saw a pattern she had been dismantling her whole career, people confusing domination for leadership. Her aides crowded behind her that day, nervous energy humming through the air, but she remained anchored. This moment was familiar territory, another arena where someone tried to rattle her into self-betrayal. Her only weapon was focus. The camera flash might blind others. For her, it marked a stage where restraint was revolution. Crockett's journey had not been flatteringly linear, it twisted through nights of exhaustion, loss, and the constant calculus of being underestimated. But that journey had carved precision into every fiber of her voice. And now, in this chamber filled with spectators waiting for scandal, she embodied something rarer than eloquence: peace under pressure. Bondi might have thought her shouting could command compliance, that a lifetime of courtroom theatrics still dictated who controlled the narrative. What she hadn't accounted for was the woman across from her, the one who had already weathered decades of condescension and lived to smile through it. And now, facing a woman who mistook loudness for power, Crockett would remind America what true strength sounds like. The hearing room, already tight with unease, began to vibrate with the unmistakable sound of one voice determined not to surrender. Pam Bondi leaned closer to the microphone, its red light flickering like a warning. Her words spilled faster now, each one sharpened to a point, each one designed to leave no room for reply. The rhythm of her speech had turned aggressive, the tone verging on accusation rather than inquiry. Her voice filled every inch of the chamber, and somewhere in her rising pitch was an edge of desperation she couldn't disguise. "Answer the question," she snapped, lips pulled tight, eyes gleaming not with curiosity but command. She could sense control slipping, and she wanted it back the only way she'd ever known, by force of volume. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She adjusted the microphone slightly, the small metallic click somehow louder than Bondi's tirade. When she finally spoke, her words arrived in a tempo so deliberate that it redefined the room's pace. "I am answering your question, ma'am," she said evenly, each syllable chosen as if it had been weighed for exact balance. No tremor, no hint of panic. Just precision. For a moment, silence hovered. But like a storm unwilling to pass, Bondi surged again. "No, you're deflecting," she interjected, voice cutting across Crockett's mid-sentence. The interruption echoed through the chamber, a sound both familiar and exhausting. Those who had watched women get talked over their entire lives felt the old ache of déjà vu, an entire history condensed into one clash of tonal frequencies. Crockett refused to yield the floor. "If you would allow me to finish," she said calmly, not pleading for space but declaring her entitlement to it. Her gaze didn't falter, it simply waited. The contrast between her restraint and Bondi's indignation was almost theatrical. Everyone in the room felt the shift of sympathy, slow, powerful, unstoppable. Committee members glanced at each other, unsure how to intervene without becoming part of the spectacle. One cleared his throat, another scribbled aimlessly on a notepad, pretending not to witness the slow unraveling of decorum. Even the chair's gavel hesitated. No one wanted to be the one to silence a reckoning unfolding in real time. Bondi's tone turned clipped, defensive, the sound of someone losing her rhythm. She rephrased the same question, louder this time, hoping repetition would restore authority. But Crockett's steady replies punctured through every attempt. Her sentences were lean, her diction so exact it seemed rehearsed, yet every word pulsed with authenticity. "To be clear," she began softly, "facts don't become facts by who says them the loudest." The remark wasn't barbed, yet it landed like a blow. The phrase hung in the charged air while Bondi blinked, startled by the elegance of the counterstrike. What the cameras couldn't capture was the energy that rushed through the gallery in that instant, the contained applause inside chests, the quiet fist clenched behind crossed arms, the collective thought. She said it without shouting. Bondi regrouped, her jaw tightening. "So you think this is about volume?" She shot back, laughter edging toward disbelief. Her words trembled slightly on the last syllable. She didn't see it yet, but the imbalance between them was becoming impossible to ignore. Crockett was no longer playing defense, she was guiding the tempo, conducting the descent by sheer composure. It wasn't just an argument anymore, it was a mirror reflecting two philosophies of power. One clung to authority like armor, the other wielded dignity as strategy. With every interruption, Bondi revealed insecurity, with every pause, Crockett revealed mastery. Someone from the back row whispered, "She's unfazed." Another muttered, "Watch this." They could feel it building, the shift from confrontation to revelation. Bondi tried again, her voice thinly veiled in assertiveness. "Do you deny what I'm saying?" "No," Crockett replied, "I'm clarifying what actually happened." Her emphasis was soft but final, converting what had been a sparring match into evidence of control. The tension snapped taut, and for the first time, Bondi blinked too long before responding. Reporters watching from the media section scribbled furiously, understanding that this wasn't just testimony, it was a cultural moment unfolding live, a contest of composure against chaos, intellect against insistence, future against past. Bondi, realizing how visibly rattled she'd become, tried to reset her tone. "Well," she said, voice thinning, "perhaps I'll finish my thought." Crockett leaned forward slightly, her calm returning like gravity to a drifting object. "By all means," she replied, each word dipped in poised courtesy. Every listener felt their pulse quicken, breath suspended. Something significant was about to break through the noise, something that would leave the entire chamber frozen and the internet ablaze. Then came the sentence that sent social media into a collective gasp. For a heartbeat, the entire chamber seemed suspended in vacuum. You could hear the faint tick of a wall clock, a pen rolling from someone's notebook and clattering to the carpet. Bondi's jaw was still half set in its last syllable when Jasmine Crockett leaned slightly toward the mic. Not enough to look aggressive, just enough to signal that she had heard every word and chosen carefully to respond. Her voice emerged steady, low, carrying through the room with surgical calm. "You know, ma'am," she began, "it's interesting how often women who look like me are called emotional the moment we speak with conviction. Meanwhile, shouting is somehow considered strength." The words weren't shouted. They simply landed. For the first time all morning, Bondi didn't interject. Her smirk froze mid-forming, the edges of confidence dimming under bright lights. Crockett continued, tone measured, eyes fixed directly across the table. "I was raised to believe that power isn't about volume, it's about value. Facts don't increase in truth just because you raise your voice over them." The silence that followed was dense, humming with awareness. A staffer near the back whispered, "Wow," almost under his breath. Cameras pivoted at once, the slow mechanical whirring echoing like thunder as they refocused on Crockett's face. The scene shifted. This was no longer two people trading jabs. It was a reckoning being documented by history's unblinking lens. "You came here to throw accusations," Crockett continued, "but I came here to speak about accountability. Those aren't the same thing." Her tone softened just enough to make the contrast sharp. She leaned back slightly, as though physically returning the heat that had been hurled her way. The move inverted the hierarchy. Suddenly, Bondi was the one reacting to calm instead of commanding it. Bondi tried to smile, but it faltered. The cameras caught the moment her certainty cracked. You could see her search for interruption, any escape hatch in the cadence of Crockett's response, and find none. Crockett pressed on, each phrase deliberate, tight, echoing like a well-scored refrain. "I learned in courtrooms, long before I learned in Congress, that noise is often a substitute for clarity. And I've seen what happens when we confuse intimidation with truth. It's the innocent who pay for it." Every statement hit with the precision of testimony. Even those predisposed to disagree found themselves unable to look away. The texture of her speech carried something beyond rebuttal. It carried dignity weaponized for justice. The transformation was complete. The accused had become the examiner. The examined had been called to answer without a question being asked. Bondi's hands tightened on the table, knuckles whitening. She shifted, clearing her throat, but no words emerged. The power she once held in voice was dissolving in the quiet rising around her. Crockett's gaze didn't waver. "I respect your experience," she said firmly, "but respect isn't surrender. It means I'll meet your argument with facts, not fear." The line sliced through the air, audible grace layered over unmissable firmness. A reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence, another's phone was already recording, knowing instinctively that this would be the clip making the evening montage. On the far side of the dais, a congressional aide muttered, "We've all been waiting for someone to say that." Even those without microphones seemed caught in the gravitational pull of the exchange. Crockett continued, neither rushed nor hesitant, "If the goal of this committee is truth, then we need to let it speak uninterrupted. If the goal is spectacle, then you've already achieved it." That final clause hit like an anvil wrapped in silk. Bondi's eyes blinked rapidly, uncertain whether to respond or recoil. She chose the former, opening her mouth, but nothing coherent arrived. The audience didn't cheer, decorum forbade it. Still, the energy shifted palpably, like a crowd exhaling after a near collision. Phones began vibrating quietly in pockets, alerts, notifications, early headlines. Calm crushes chaos in congressional clash. Crockett's next sentence wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of every moment she'd been spoken over in her life. "I don't need to shout to make myself heard. The truth carries just fine on its own." You could measure the silence that followed in heartbeats. Outside the chamber, sound editors and interns in media rooms were already marking timestamps. The viral seed had been planted, subtle and unstoppable. Even the furniture seemed to lean in. The wooden tables gleamed under fluorescent glare, The air conditioning hum softened into an almost cinematic underscore. Bondi shifted again, this time visibly smaller in her seat. She attempted a shrug that stumbled halfway to deflection. Crockett wasn't gloating. There was no smugness, only a controlled sincerity that cut deeper than mockery ever could. "This isn't a game," she added quietly. "Some of us came here to work, not to perform." That landed harder than any accusation. It stripped the spectacle bare and left only contrast, diligence against drama, intention against impulse. Bondi's practiced theatrics suddenly looked antiquated, a remnant of political performance that no longer stirred awe but discomfort. Cameras zoomed closer, internet streams froze from traffic spikes, producers mouthed, "Clip that." The world outside the chamber was beginning to turn. Back inside, a faint cough broke the silence. The chair finally glanced nervously at his notes, unsure how to proceed. But the hearing's focus wasn't his to reclaim, it had migrated to the woman who had just redrawn the boundaries of restraint. Crockett finished the way she had begun, calm, factual, unambiguous. "What we owe the public," she said, "is more listening, less shouting. Otherwise, all we do here is teach the next generation that noise is the same thing as leadership." Bondi's shoulders dropped slightly, her pen slipped from her fingers and hit the table with a soft metallic ring. All eyes stayed on her for a beat, but she didn't move. Crockett's gaze remained poised yet distant, as if the argument had already passed into memory. That was the moment, the shift from confrontation to legacy. The clip would replay millions of times, not for its drama but for its discipline. Viewers would later describe it as the second when the yelling stopped being scary and started looking small. The hearing room exhaled collectively. Nothing dramatic, just dozens of people realizing they had witnessed poise turn into power before their eyes. Across the country, interns trimming footage, podcasters finding audio, and commentators recording takes would all recognize it instantly, a transformation captured at 24 frames per second. Calm had not only survived chaos, it had defeated it. By nightfall, millions would see it, and the internet would choose sides. Within minutes of the exchange, before the gavel had even dropped, the clip began its orbit. Someone in the press row uploaded the 30-second highlight, Bondi's glare frozen mid-frame, Crockett's calm unbroken. Within 15 minutes it crossed into trending territory, algorithmic wildfire. On Twitter, the first fan edit surfaced with a caption, "Power doesn't shout, it settles." It gathered 50,000 likes in the time it takes a committee aide to refill a water glass. Across social media, an echo began to form. TikTok users layered the moment over triumphant string music, captions flashing, #Compower, #Bondi Meltdown, #Composure Goals. Split screens multiplied, Bondi on one side, lips curled in motion, Crockett on the other, unmoved, blinking once before delivering her line of pure equilibrium. Comment sections filled with digital applause. She defended every woman ever talked over in a meeting, one post read. Another, "That's what grace under fire looks like. Take notes." Cable networks scrambled for airtime. Producers yelled across newsrooms, "Get the clip. Get the clip." Until every channel led with a split frame, the firebrand versus the calm strategist. Analysts dissected tone like crime scene evidence. One conservative pundit tried to frame it as a difference in communication styles, but even through the politest euphemisms, viewers sensed the shift. What once might have played as dominance now looked like desperation caught in HD. Podcasters shouted each other down, while ironically discussing composure. Late-night hosts reenacted the exchange with comedic precision, one feigning volcanic rage, the other whispering a devastating one-liner that brought house lights down. Even in parody, the moral had settled. Silence can thunder louder than screaming. Offline, the image sparked something stickier than a trend. Schools played the clip during debate club meetings. Managers circulated it in workplace emails with the subject line, "A lesson in poise." Teenagers on group chats sent the meme of Crockett's serene face paired with a caption, "Me when chaos tries me before coffee." The collective audience, long marinated in performative anger, seemed hungry for a new archetype, the person who wins by thinking. Meanwhile, Bondi's camp waded through the reaction cycle with forced nonchalance. Her spokesperson tweeted that the congresswoman had simply been passionate, but passion had already been redefined. Other commentators rushed to her defense, reframing volume as authenticity. Yet their insistence only magnified the contrast. Every explanation sounded like justification for something most people had already rejected. Crockett herself stayed offline that day, but her name didn't need her presence. The clip did the work. Journalists called it the composure moment of the year. One headline read, "When calm became contagious." Fundraising platforms lit up, donations surged not out of partisanship but recognition. Viewers saw in her an antidote to the noise fatigue that politics had long induced. In barbershops and coffee lines, the conversation spun outward. "Did you see that congresswoman? The one who stayed chill under fire?" People asked each other like sharing weather updates. For some, she became proof that intellect could still dominate without shouting. For others, she represented endurance, that quiet resistance practiced daily by those forced to navigate power with strategic restraint. Even critics unwittingly extended her reach. They loathed the applause, claimed civility was overrated, that politics required aggression. But their protests only affirmed the narrative taking root. Society had grown weary of the performance of strength and was rediscovering its substance. Within 48 hours, mashups multiplied. One video placed Crockett's response against archival footage of civil rights speeches, her calm expression matching the gravity of the past. Another edited Bondi's rising volume into a waveform that visually broke apart halfway through, captioned the exact second composure one. The internet, unpredictable but perceptive, had chosen its metaphor. Commentators began calling it not a debate but a tone shift. Editorials filled Sunday opinion pages, arguing that Crockett's moment wasn't about party lines but about linguistic evolution, the nation's fatigue with outrage as entertainment. "Maybe the real disruption," one columnist wrote, "is that quiet confidence is finally trending." In classrooms, professors of rhetoric dissected the clip frame by frame, mapping how Crockett's pauses calibrated persuasion better than sound bites ever could. Activists quoted her in speeches about reclaiming narrative control. The resonance spread beyond politics, into family dinners, staff meetings, even arguments online where someone mid-rant would post her image like a digital mirror saying, "Consider your tone." By the weekend, late-night comedy had exhausted jokes, the internet memes had begun looping on themselves. Yet the moment remained because underneath the humor lay recognition. Composure felt revolutionary precisely because it was rare. Every retweet whispered the same subtext, that a nation exhausted by shouting had found a new form of power to admire. Inside congressional halls, aides whispered about the Crockett effect. Colleagues who once dismissed her as unremarkable now measured her differently. Reporters noted the subtle recalibration, how loud voices softened when she entered a room, how decorum, long thought extinct, seemed to flicker back into possibility. Bondi's entourage attempted to reset the narrative with a follow-up interview, but the questions all looped back to that clip. "Were you surprised by her reaction?" one anchor asked. Bondi dodged, smiled tight, spoke of healthy debate. But the audience had already moved on. They weren't debating the argument anymore, they were replaying the demeanor. A new comment appeared beneath one of the viral threads. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about redefining what victory looks like. It gathered tens of thousands of likes overnight. And somewhere beneath the noise of trending tags, a quieter current was forming. People wondering out loud if this could be the model for discourse reclaimed from spectacle. But beyond the trending tags, a deeper question emerged. What does this moment mean for how we argue as a nation? When the fury faded and the feed slowed, what remained was silence, dense, reflective, almost reverent. The moment between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett had traveled the entire circuit of modern attention, fascination, reaction, meme, analysis. But beneath all that noise, something simpler endured. It was the rediscovery of an ancient truth wearing contemporary clothes, that composure is not the absence of power, it is its purest form. People replayed the clip not simply to watch a takedown, but to study steadiness. Crockett's restraint became a kind of meditation, one that spoke to everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, everyone who had ever swallowed rage in order to keep their job, their dignity, or their peace. Her calm didn't look submissive. It looked sovereign. In that quiet poise, viewers saw not just political mastery but emotional literacy, a blueprint for surviving a century addicted to outrage. Commentators tried to explain it in strategic terms: timing, optics, media savvy. But strategy only carried it so far. What resonated was the moral undercurrent, the way Crockett's measured tone whispered something every viewer understood intuitively: you don't have to become the noise to defeat it. In an era where shouting had become shorthand for sincerity, her composure recalibrated what authenticity could mean. Across dinner tables and text chains, the discussion turned contemplative. "Did you see how she didn't take the bait?" someone would say, half amazed, half relieved. The exchange became allegory, outrage crashing against resilience and dissolving into nothing. Every time the video looped, hope seemed to restate itself, that restraint could still win ground in a world built to reward chaos. It wasn't just Crockett who triumphed that day, it was everyone tired of mistaking aggression for leadership. Her victory belonged to teachers who keep their cool in classrooms of noise, to nurses absorbing anger through midnight shifts, to parents practicing patience in the supermarket aisle. Each viewer found in her an affirmation that dignity is still a usable resource in civic life. Political historians began to position the hearing as a minor footnote, a clip gone viral. But cultural memory repurposed it as myth. It marked a pivot, a gentle declaration that maturity could still pierce through manufactured fury. And that reminder arrived not through shout or spectacle, but through breath control, posture, and the courage to pause. Even Bondi, in later interviews, seemed to acknowledge the shift. Told by journalists that her opponent's calm had become legend, she replied, she stayed composed, and the concession itself sounded almost admiring. The world had witnessed not humiliation, but transformation, the loud discovering that silence could hurt more than any insult. Crockett never claimed moral victory. She simply returned to work, as she always had, armed with the rhythm of fairness. Yet her stillness had planted itself in the national psyche. The moment reminded citizens that democracy isn't sustained by volume, it's sustained by listening, patience, and the humility to learn in public. The lesson stretched beyond gender or politics into something elemental: character outlasts spectacle. The people who watched her that day weren't cheering for a side, they were cheering for the possibility of grace as a public act. They saw calm handle chaos and win, and for a fleeting instant, the abyss between what we applaud online and what we admire in life seemed to close. Weeks later, when a new controversy emerged somewhere else, as controversies endlessly do, reporters still referenced that exchange. Remember how Crockett handled hers, they'd say, invoking composure as benchmark. Her measured voice became shorthand for integrity in the face of provocation. Because calm, when grounded in truth, is contagious. And though the buzz of social media would eventually fade, the lesson embedded itself where it mattered, in the quiet choices people make before responding, before shouting, before hitting post. And long after the cameras turned off, that calm voice kept echoing. The hearing exists now only in replay, but the image remains burned into collective memory: Pam Bondi leaning forward, speechless mid-sentence, Jasmine Crockett sitting perfectly still, the calm center of a storm that had run out of thunder. The crowd's breath held, the cameras blinked, and somewhere between outrage and grace, history tilted by a fraction. That moment became its own verdict. The shouting faded, the dignity stayed. It whispered a message louder than any gavel strike, that composure is not weakness but endurance refined into art. Crockett didn't win through volume, she won through values, proving that truth need not scream to be heard. As the footage loops across every platform, it asks something of each person watching. It asks managers in tense meetings, students in heated debates, parents on the edge of frustration to remember the lesson caught in a single exhale: strength measured by stillness is strength that lasts. The hearing room now stands frozen in that mental freeze frame, papers mid-air, microphones catching silence, light glancing off Crockett's steady gaze. The soundtrack of chaos cuts, replaced by a hum of awareness. Civility may look outdated, yet it's the only remedy that ever changes anything. So if her calm moved you, carry that calm into your next argument, your next online clash, your next difficult day. Let composure become the rebellion against a culture addicted to noise. Honor that part of yourself that refuses to match anger with anger. Because someday when the shouting around you swells again, you'll remember that still image from the hearing. The chaos paused, the dignified unmoved, and you'll know which side of history sounds like power. Sometimes power whispers.